welcome to this Sunday morning session. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what the session's about, a little bit more about who's on the panel here with us today, and why we programmed this in particular. And also Daniel's going to share with you a little bit about why he's so interested in this particular work. And then we're going to hand over to the incredible Josina to tell us more, and Farzana will be involved as well in the conversation. So welcome, friends. Sunday morning, day 5. There's been so many incredible sessions over the last 5 days, lots of different angles as to how we should think about what's next. And this next session is incredibly important within that. We've mentioned a lot of times through very different various means for the last 6 months or so, the absolute foundational part of what land means and how we build our social and civic infrastructure. And over the last 5 or 6 years, you'll know that at the Hub and at Civic Square, we've been working on lots of different versions of that. And land reparations is something that is pivotal in all of this. And so we couldn't be more excited to welcome Josina. This is a good time to remind you that if you're enjoying this session and this content, there's a list of crowdfunders that you can support or share and amplify, because the content you've received is all free and complimentary. And in there's a particularly important project around land. So perhaps that's a good time to go and share and amplify it. So the session is to hear lots more about LION, which is the acronym for Land in Our Names. Josina Calliste is a health professional, land worker, activist and co-founder of Land in Our Names, aka LION, a community project addressing lack of access and ownership of land amongst Black communities and underserved groups in Britain. She loves nature. She loves nature walks and hopes to set up an eco-village in the future. Now that is pretty exciting. So you can follow Josina on Jo_ZINAC on Twitter, and Farzana's also there. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Daniel to tell you a little bit more about why we're so interested. Then Daniel's going to hand to Josina. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm really excited about this session. So thanks Josina for joining us in the Department of Dreams. I'm Daniel. I'm part of the Civic Square team, and for me, I'll tell you a little story about what I did last year, and hopefully it gives a little picture as to why I'm so interested in this session. So last year, I started a little experiment. I live in a city, Birmingham, like not too far from the city, in a house that is owned by my parents. It's just a flat, and there's no real green space in terms of a garden around it. But what there is a wash yard, and the wash yard was left kind of dilapidated. It was a kind of place where someone had been doing some urban farming before, some growing of food. And just one day I got up and said, I'm gonna renovate this. I'm gonna set it up into a growing space. But I had no knowledge of how to do this, or what I wanted to actually grow, or how to do it. But I had friends who were talking about the need to think about growing food. And so I just got them together for one day to kind of just do up the space, get the beds ready, and start to grow some food. This was at the end of May, so it's even past the peak kind of growing season where you start preparing the soil and stuff. But we just went through it anyway. And we did it. It was a really nice day. Just got some friends together, all people of color, people from my own sort of background and have similar culture and stuff. And we transformed the space. And then I decided to go and tell that story on Twitter. And I was really blown away by the response that it got. How much people were sort of inspired, but also curious that this group of people had decided to do this in the place that we'd done it. And yeah, it went a bit crazy. And then I got the media calling me up, BBC Midlands Today got in touch and we did a little story, and then Birmingham Mail, and then Joe Politics, and all these different platforms were wanting to talk to me about this story. And I was like, well, why? All I was doing was just like growing some food. I didn't ask for all this attention, like, but it was just really interesting that. And then as I started to ask more questions, I realized that urge to sort of assert a right to the land around the place where I live was probably the underlying thing as to why there was so much attention and interest in the story. And just also the fact that my kind of lineage, my heritage, my ancestors this is just stuff that they've always done. And it had kind of come back to me in this moment to actually just go and do it. And I had no knowledge of it, but I just wanted to like learn and stuff. So just decided to experiment. And so, yeah, like just these questions around sort of what it means for people like myself to assert a right to land around the place where I live. And I'm just here to learn and listen and also ask questions where I hear things that are more interesting to me. Because I know Josina would probably been doing this work for a while now, so I'm curious to learn from you and your experiences. So I'm going to hand over to you and let's talk.
Brilliant, Daniel. Thank you so much. You're really like providing a lot of heart for you know, what it is that we've all been working towards. And growing food truly is one of the most revolutionary acts, and it shouldn't be really in a lot of ways that it's so curious to people. Well, why would you do that? And in lots of inner city areas, particularly for us, for Black people, for people of colour, it is seen as something new. And you're right that it's something that we grew up hearing about our ancestors doing. You know, there's a lot of our knowledge that we can carry forward. So I'll start with a bit of background about me. I haven't been doing it for that long at all. I worked in sexual health for over a decade, and it was doing a PhD in sexual health in an environment that just wasn't really, you know, I wasn't growing in it as I should be. The soil was wrong, the light was wrong, and I enrolled in like an introductory permaculture course, like as I was burning out of the PhD. And, you know, thinking that, because, you know, as someone who's like second generation immigrant, you think like, well, they just wanted me to keep going through all the educational steps. But actually, you know, my parents have also been introducing me to like land and gardening, growing our own food my whole life. And so thinking that I'd failed when actually this is a lot better. So I started getting more involved in permaculture, but also thinking about what the intersections were between, you know, first, like, where did the ideas come from? And Leah Penniman, who runs Soulfire Farm in the States, which is a social justice farm, like she articulated it perfectly when I met her in January, and saying that permaculture isn't real. It's a made up thing that college educated white men have used to profit off indigenous farming practices that are so many generations old. And it's true, you know, why is it that I've been paying money to learn so much about permaculture when I probably could have learned to access it through lots of people who weren't college educated, maybe had never left their countries. So yeah, getting more involved in permaculture since about 2017. And then reading the Land for the Many report, which was commissioned by Labour and involved people like George Monbiot, big environmentalist, Guy Shrubsole, Who Owns England, and just getting enraged at things that I didn't know about land and seeing how much injustice is based on land that we had no idea about. Like, golf courses are getting subsidies and they're so environmentally damaging, and that we all have the right to an allotment, but we actually can't get one. And just so many different things, particularly in England, and how we're kept in inner cities, and also thinking, right, this is great for the general population, and the land justice movement is very white. It also knows it's quite white, which is good, because there's like lots of gaps that they want people to come in and fill and make sure that the movement is overall more diverse. So that, combined with going to Soulfire Farm last August, and learning about how they approach reparations, and they have a whole reparations map which matches people to different land projects, so that they can distribute resources. And I mean, we can't learn loads from the United States because it's such a different context. And in this country, I guess it's been so underfunded, the environmental diversity work, and land, agriculture and the environment sectors are the least diverse professions in Britain. They're both about 96 to 98% white British. And so this has been going on for a long time, that lots of people struggle to get into environment or land work, but what the barriers are increased for people from visible racialized minorities. So yeah, Land in Our Names, the name just sort of came to me about a year ago, and then I was already meeting lots of people working in the land sector, and with Ola, who works for Shared Assets, we co-founded it. And then I went to Soulfire Farm and came back being like, yeah, guys, like there's loads of things that we can do and that need to be done. And that gave us a sort of starting point for what Land in Our Names would look like. So we're a collective. It's a Black-led team, but we work for the interests of Black and people of colour across Britain, and we are using a reparative justice framework and thinking that, yes, we should be able to buy land, but we also, there's a lot of land that is there that's not being used, and that there's a lot of resources that could be better used or shared. And what's great is that there is a real appetite for sharing those resources, actually. And we've got a lot of people approaching us saying, hey, like, in about 20 years, I might be inheriting land. And so, I mean, with land and cultivation, you have to use a really long-term framework, like thinking about things in a really long-term way. Anyone who's like wanting to think about like how their woodland is managed in 20 years and thinking about how social justice is embedded in that, that's really interesting to us. And it's a bit sad at the moment, because the plan for this year was to be visiting a lot of projects that are run by people of colour. And we started the year at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference, which was the most diverse conference that they'd had for a long time. And then we did this, we did a session there that was called Farming So White, with Leah Penniman from Soulfire Farm, and that was thinking about like land inequalities and bringing a new conversation. The room was packed, and then after that we convened a caucus at the Willowbrook Farm, which is the first halal family organic farm in the UK, and they are great hosts. And we had like lots of Black and brown farmers, food growers, landless people who would be interested in doing these things. And it was a really emotional day. Like lots of people were saying, like hugging and crying, and like, oh, this idea has like, it's found its time, I guess, but also it's really overdue. And the people who are working in food production who are Black and brown, they're often the only one, or they're often really isolated. And like this is spread across Britain, and we can't fix that, but building a strong network. And it's really nice to see people like Daniel, like Imi, like a couple of people on the call who've got their various projects and crowdfunds open, that the movement is growing, and it's growing quite rapidly, but the plan was to be visiting these all through this year and bringing the network together, and it's really sad that we can't do that. And then a lot of the reasons why we exist as Lion, to do this reparations work and to bring these people together, is because of entrenched inequalities that are being highlighted through pandemic, like health inequalities, like air pollution, which can worsen things like, who has access to outdoor areas and private garden spaces, and being a Black person, seeing police brutality on one side and then being blamed for death because of like low vitamin D intake, and then not being able to get outside, and they're not able to gather in communities and heal from that. So that's sort of brief overview. I feel like I'll be much better in conversation with Farzana in terms of like really articulating what we've been up to and what's important to us. But I guess what I love about working, starting Lion and building it, is that we center reparations. We really think about like spiritual ecology, and have grounding and thinking about like the wisdom of our elders and ancestors in all that we do. And yeah, just learning to work with the land as a friend, as a comrade, as a mother. It's such a new and nourishing way of working, and going from a really like unhealthy academic environment, been one of the most beautiful things that I have been witnessing, curating, leading on.
Thank you so much. I feel really honored. I just want to say this, like, I am so excited to hear Josina, and so grateful for the work that you do. I think it's truly something so revolutionary, so needed, and with so much heart. So just to witness you is gorgeous. I think the first question that I would like to kind of bring into the space, and Imi and Daniel, please also come into the conversation, is that all of us on the call are doing this work around land justice in a city environment. And so it'd be great to hear what that kind of looks like, what the manifestation of that is, or in those different contexts, because it's not necessarily in a rural environment. So yeah, Josina, do you want to begin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of one strand of our work is a ruralization, and thinking about the city as somewhere that we haven't necessarily been by choice, or that we've not had all the choices open to us. And like, I screen areas for how many friends have said that they've experienced racism, for whether I'll go there on holiday. Cornwall's just been out. It's just not happening, because that's the place where most people that I know that have gone have been stared at or experienced racial abuse. So, and thinking about who is in our network, who are accomplices, allies, who are white, and who is in our networks who are Black and people of colour on the land, who are making it easier to not be in the city, or be in the city because you want to be, not because you want to be. And reimagining what's possible. But then also, like, urban growing is so important, and we work with projects like Black Roots, which are up in Tottenham, and organically. Oh yeah, I'm really London centric, so I'm trying not to be so. And yeah, like, where the frontiers of activism are. So I got really excited when there was a petition to open up the golf courses, because those are just ridiculous waste space, really exclusive, very unfriendly to like ecologies. And like, if that was all growing spaces, then would we have had the panic buying for food that we saw at the beginning of lockdown? Like, what if we had, like, if those land inequalities were made visible, and we knew exactly what we could do with the land in terms of where our kids could play, where we can grow food, where we can like gather safely as well, or use green spaces in a way that we're not hemmed in into tiny parks. People aren't really aware of that, and there's a deliberate campaign to make us not aware of that. And so urban spaces are the frontier, and what peri-urban means and looks like in terms of like us starting to farm in those spaces, because we do need farming spaces that are part of inner cities. We should fight for city farms and county farms, places where people can learn.
Speak on this a little bit before I hand over to Daniel, because Daniel's got some really great examples from his actual neighbourhood. I think our approach to it has been, or sort of my involvement in the approach to this work has been quite specific and particular. So I definitely can't speak from the same angle as Josina and Daniel on literally being on the land and growing and doing that work, although I can speak to kind of a long history of my family, my grandparents doing that quite naturally and normally when they were here, when they came to this country, but prior to that in Punjab, and then starting to learn about what happened with the way colonial rule diverted water and the 5 rivers of Punjab, which now is still having an impact today on farmers' lives, and there's the highest suicide rate of male farmers in Punjab than there is in the whole of India. In 1 year, 1,700 farmers in Punjab committed suicide, died by suicide. And so when I was first doing my master's on international development, and I came across this work, I started to realise, like quite deeply, the role of land and who owns the land, and how decisions around resource can go on to have catastrophic effects for generations to come. And so in the 2000s, 1,700 farmers are dying by suicide in a year due to resource decisions that were made to rule over people, both in this generation but by colonial rule. So that's like the grounding as to why I became interested in it. Then my interest in the work became really specific, and this is where Josina sort of speaks to white allies in the space. So I joined 00 and started working quite closely with Alistair Parvin, who was doing WikiHouse and looking at decentralized making and other things like that. And I met Andy, who was doing lots of data work on mapping small sites and seeing what was possible with them. And through the years, what I've been really trying to do is like understand the mechanisms within which we can unlock land in this country. But most importantly now, I'm just focusing on a really particular slice of it, which is once we've got that land, or we've got parts of land that we can access, what's the most transformative thing that we can do with it? So growing and play is obviously of huge interest to me, but the thing that's really focused, the project that we're really trying to show and make happen in the next couple of years is to show the link between local neighborhood manufacturing, the technology we have to be able to make homes in our, to build homes in our neighborhoods, to then use that to deep reskill people who are going to be out of jobs due to lots of shifts in what's happening with the climate, what's happening with AI and other things taking over jobs, generational shifts, all of that, and linking it to skills, so high res skills that will be useful in the future. So to young people looking for that skills. And what we're hoping to show at Civic Square in the next couple of years is just taking a small patch of land, having a neighborhood housing factory on a piece of land that the neighborhood owns as a CLT, that can then skill up local people to build those homes to be zero carbon, and what cost you can do that with. And I've had just the best 7 years exploring all of this with Andy and Alistair about what you can do with small sites, what you can do with the little plots of land that people don't want to touch. But what I'm obsessed with now is showing this project in reality. So in 5 years' time, we actually have like a bunch of possibility projects, prototypes that say, when you get the land, it can go to play, to growing. You could potentially, and this is a bit out there yet, we're still working on how you do it. You could potentially use those resources to have the neighborhood retrofit itself. So there's a little geeky fact here where we need to retrofit houses, like 50,000 a day. Houses need to be retrofitted to be able to start to meet energy standards that will help us to deal with carbon emissions and all of that. And so many retrofit projects have failed because there have been these huge, massive projects from the state downwards. And the only people who can really opt in is middle-class families who are in the climate movement, who are like, yeah, I want to like some solar panels, or I want to do this. So our thesis is something like, if you do all of this, if you interest people at a neighborhood level, they can see what you can do with the land, they see the potential. We then have the making equipment to be able to build houses locally. Then in theory, from this factory, you could also, mini factory, from this pop-up resource, you could also retrofit the neighborhood's houses and get people interested in doing it for themselves, as well as with professionals. So this is really geeky, and hopefully this is the last time I talk about it. But why I'm interested in this conversation is I just want to do that small part of the work, that when we start to claim back this stuff, it can be farms, and it can be play, and it can be maybe transformative housing, right? That's just a little thesis we're working on. So I'm kind of just heads down on that. Luckily, the stuff Daniel is working on is far more everyday and really exciting. So I'm going to hand over to him to hopefully tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, so just thinking about Farzana's question, having been proximate to all the thinking and the opportunities and the possibilities through Alistair and the work that have been part with Imi and all the rest of it. I obviously, being of this generation, I'm still very interested in technology and design, but more deeply, I think agency and how people access the kind of agency over their space around them. And for me, it was a case of like just starting where I am, where I find myself, and just looking around to see like, okay, what potential is there here? Like, and actually my area that I live, even though it's in a city, there is quite a bit of like green space, like the trees on the street. There's more trees on the street than like in many other spaces, and just like actually noticing things like that and noticing spaces that maybe flooded with litter, but actually could be rewilded or thought about in a different way. In the only way that like rural places become a city is like over a long period of time, people end up there and like turn it into this kind of concrete jungle that that is not good for the natural world. So we can reverse some of that, I think, and reverse our thinking around that. And so just, but also the side of it where like seeing projects where like you can create urban farm, like micro farms, and like using technology and different things. I think that can evoke curiosity in people as to the future of this, because a lot of people have this idea that this stuff is archaic and like it's like primitive and all that rest of all of that stuff that needs to be broken down, I think, as well. And so like I just think that like in introducing new methods of making and ways of looking at that can help to evoke that curiosity again in people, especially this generation and the ones coming up, to say that this stuff is like what sustains us, and do it in a way that's more environmentally friendly and stuff. So one of the things that I'm looking at doing next is building a grow room, which is like open source fabricated spherical garden on the street, and building it with some neighbors and some friends that have been hanging out around the area. So just to do that, to like make a point that we can have beautiful things in the so-called ghetto, and people can like get back into that growing and stuff like that. So yeah, we'll see how that goes anyway.
Thank you. And for myself, my entry point was I really appreciated what Imi and Josina and Daniel have touched on in terms of it being led by the underserved communities, because my entry point into thinking around land justice really came from hostile design of our environments. The first kind of two local planting or garden, rooftop gardens I was part of was from the local authority, and they were actually part of regeneration gentrification efforts. So, and I didn't know that. I was a youth worker then, I was very young, and I like led a planting project which made the local area look prettier so that people could move into the area. And that was because it was led by the state, and it was led with a particular agenda. And upon reflection over the years, I really thought about what it means when these kind of surface level, let's plant some trees here, let's have some rooftop gardens here, actually didn't do the work of what might be ownership, but ownership didn't feel right for me because of what Aurora Levins-Morales says is, ownership shatters ecology. And so it became about belonging. What does it mean for us to belong to the space, for the land to call us, to be in our names, and also the belonging then returning us back to what is native to us, like the ways that, like my dad, he was known as the guy who had coriander seeds in his pocket, his chest pocket, because he grew the best coriander in our garden. So, and he would just keep it in his coat pocket all the time near his heart. And when I was growing up, I had a lot of shame that we grew our own food because people bought it at the shop, and it's capitalism and all of these things. And now we have this new wave of people who can afford to grow their own land and grow their own food. And so, really understanding the relationship between racial capitalism, like the way that space was designed, and actually moving into the things that kind of Imi was talking about. If we really want to have access to land and our infrastructure, then we have to belong to it, and it has to belong to us too. And creating that deeper sense of access, and in the energy democracy movement spaces, that kind of strategy of how does anti-gentrification efforts become part of climate justice work, and how does housing connect with how we design housing, and connect to how we are living in our environments, doing the transition to zero carbon economies and those types of processes. So it was a really exciting process. And I think similar to Josina, permaculture has been a really huge part in my thinking, less because I'm involved in land work, but more because of the principles of designing for social change. And I think that really helped me understand that our environments are designed, but they're suited to a particular purpose, and that means they can be undesigned. And that's really, really exciting. So those are my kind of entry points into this kind of work.
I love what you said there, Farzana, about moving from ownership to belonging, and for the land to call us to be in our names, because I feel like that seeing the potential of the space around where I live. So that house where I live now is where I lived until I was 4 years old, and my dad kept it and rented it out and stuff. And I think it was a couple of years ago, I said, okay, I was going to go and rent somewhere and just live, I was ready to go, just move out. And I was like, no, let me just go to a place where it's kept in the family, and I have a sort of connection, because that care will be there for the place a bit more, I think. And so I just really relate to that, and I think that's part of maybe this kind of the kind of ownership thing. It's not necessarily about me owning it, because I don't, my parents do, but have a sense of connection and belonging there. So have a different relationship to it, and being open to that and led by that is why I'm kind of doing what I'm doing, amongst many other influences.
It's also so much. I mean, I can't wait to be on the land with you all. You just got so much that we're gonna do and plan. And Imi, we need to get you Centre for Alternative Technology, running a session on how to do it as a community, because they've got so much going on in terms of sustainability, but massive problems with who they're connecting with, I guess. And yeah, I would love for everyone to think about that question that you posed, what's the most transformative relationship we can have with the land, and how that looks like. All of our priorities are still like so important. For me, I just want to grow food and go off to the mountains somewhere, but we do need to, think about housing and like in both urban and rural spaces.
Like about how you frame this conversation, Josina, and like what I've really enjoyed about this work is that it just feels like I just don't feel like it's a zero-sum game, right? I just feel like there's so many parts to this story that we need to figure out together, and there's just so much to do, right? It's like the work of a generation, really, to be able to transform what happens and our relationship to land and the land, and to what possibilities there are. I mean, for me, I keep it really in the realm of growing, play, and housing. And I sometimes feel really geeky and boring in the space. But as the years have gone on, I'm like, there's a role for this tiny little bit, because then we both need to transform our relationship. We need to transform our understanding, our stewardship, our language. That's like, I think, a really big thing. I loved what Farzana said about ownership crushes ecologies, and even the way we set up the governance of Civic Square is for us to like do this work for a while, take ownership from the developer, because that's not going to be a sustainable long-term future. But then what I'm really interested in is what does it go into, and how do we make sure that, like, I'm not worried about anyone in this call, but right, how do we make sure that we aren't then captured by it at the end of 10, 15 years and we're like, well, no, we did all this work and we now own it. Because I think one of the things that's really powerful about what I've learned from Punjab is what happened when the land wasn't owned well. But then what I also know is that when it became people taking their land back, then not having the right collective governance processes also have led to like lots of generations of land fights, because people became really territorial because they were so scared of losing it the first time around. So like when I grew up hearing like all these people in families fighting for the land, and I was like, why is everybody arguing about housing in Punjab and like what's going on? And I understood that it comes from something much deeper. So figuring out how we create the things so that our own movements don't become co-opted, and we can place those things into some sort of trust, into something that we can just hand over stewardship to the next generation or to the next people coming up. I do think this is an important one to think about, just because we're kind of in the same place. We're all so desperate to and fighting for land justice to get the land back. And if we don't figure out what it's going into, I don't want to give rise to a generation who was just so grateful to be like, we've got some agency and ownership in a way where we can do what we need to do for our communities, but then we don't know what to do next, right? And so I just want to pose that as an open question, just because I think that that's what happens when your land has been colonized. Your brain can sometimes then go into that same mode of going, well, I've put so much work into this, it's mine, and like, how do we create collective governance is something I'm interested in. I don't know if anyone's got answers to that.
I might go next because you touched on what the kind of interim space that I see land work doing, which is the work of healing. And prior to COVID, Josina and I were actually, exploring ideas around land and reproductive justice and healing and sexual trauma and all of this kind of work. So very purposeful, intentional work with the land as ceremony, land as spaces of ritual and healing. And so for me, what you touched on, Imi, in terms of the territorial kind of violence that we see reproduced is absolutely a survival mechanism of the violence that our communities have experienced in terms of land. And so for me, the transformative work that land can offer us is the work of restoration and healing. And some of the reasons why in youth programs, like the two that I mentioned earlier, we did want to do that work was because what the land teaches us in terms of nurturance culture And what racial capitalism offers us is this instant, everything is instant, whatever you want, you kind of can go at, and it's very aggressive, and it's about accumulation and relentless accumulation. And when you work with the land, when you're working with growing and things, it's cycles, it's about what you put in, it's how you relate to it, it's a completely different relationship. And so when you're working, we're in environments with young people who were described at risk at schools and all of this stuff, which is not true, but weren't exposed or offered the same kinds of spaces to nurture. And so I'm really excited about what land work does in terms of disrupting cycles of violence and harm, and how it can be a space of like nurturance, which is the opposite of violence and unmaking violence. So I think that's a really exciting space to do that work too.
Yeah, I really hope that gets resourced as well. We've got so much to do. We got so much healing to do, and we had so much healing to do before we had a horrific pandemic that seriously affected our communities and is going to have long-lasting repercussions. And then now even more, we need to get back on the land. We need to learn from all of the different justice movements, and think about where whose knowledge can is that we've been ignoring all this time, and learning from internationally. Like, I'm really glad that Imi brought up like farmers in Punjab, because who's been on the front lines doing this work for a really long time. And I'm just so happy that there's people who are going to be doing this work with us.
I think just in this question around the territory, how not to be territorial and stuff, I think like what does the land go into? I think it was the other day we were talking about land, the stewardship of it, and because it's the knowledge that you cultivate in being so closely related to it, and how to look after the soils and how to look after all the stuff that you're growing there. Like, you can't just pass that on straight away when you've put that work in. And I think that's where the like, when that just gets taken away, that's where that rage comes from. And how do we have like relationships that pass that on in a more productive, in a more I think relational way, so that if you are moving away, like how does that get passed on so that it continues to be fruitful and continues to be abundant? And like if you were to move on to another land and be stewards of that, like you don't just lose the relationship straight away of where you've just come from. The cross-fertilization of that knowledge has to continue to happen. And like, how do you design for that?
I think for me anyway, I don't know for others, I think that's just an important open question to hold, right? Like, we can learn so much from our history. We can fight hard for what we need back so that we can hopefully pass on something better to the next generation that have this land. And at the same time, we can probably learn from the legacy of that violence on our own, and like parents and grandparents and great grandparents. And like, and I think I'm always pragmatic that we won't get it right in one go, but what we have to seek to do is be in solidarity around the learnings, accept the different cultural approaches and the different ways of manifesting what we do on that land, but then at the core of it, understanding how to be in like better relationship with it, because I think there's just like a core thing that's really missing. But yeah, I am just always constantly obsessed with the geeky details of like, right, so if we get this thing and we're going to do something, what are we going to test to try and design out the previous things that happened when inheritance cycles started to play out, right? And what is that? And I don't know, because like Daniel said, I think it's just a big open question that we have to keep talking to each other about, because there's no way we can figure it out ourselves whilst we're still embedded in the colonial beast and capitalist system, right? So we're just going to have to keep figuring it out. But yeah, I don't know if Josina, you've got any thoughts on that. Otherwise, Farzana, I'm really happy for you to move into your next theme.
We should move on, because I also want to hear what people's questions are. But I yeah, there are so many open questions like that, and having a new model, a new framework that is so much around like stewardship and intergenerational wisdom, and having a connection to land which goes beyond what you can articulate in terms of like existing frameworks. I stopped being an atheist through doing land work, and I was raised by like atheist communist parents, and then going like, okay, yeah, but the land's alive, like trees talk to you, and that's fine. Like I'm not, yeah. And I feel nourished from that in a way that being raised in a sort of secular Christian country didn't really work, and like colonial enforcement of religion didn't work, and I can't articulate that when I'm having meetings with large farming and food organizations, because and they're trying to get us to do like bits of diversity work, often that's very under-resourced, and like what we're trying to do that's really transformative, it doesn't tick their boxes. And so there's going to be adversity, and that's before we even get bits of land and we're trying to grow or live on them, and dealing with parish councils or whoever it is that is in charge of decision making, that is embedded in a community that we haven't had access to. So yeah, we're just going to have these big open questions, and keep having very transformative conversations, and chipping away at like dominant ideologies, particularly around land, which is so invisible, and dealing with Tories who are like landowners who roll back any kind of progressive legislation in the last century. But yeah, we're just going to have to do it.
I mean, I think some of the questions, because I'm conscious of time, I want to take some questions from the chat. Thank you for the folks that have dropped them in there. I think some of the questions, or one or two, actually spoke to Imi's question around what's the most transformative thing we could do. So I'm going to hold that one. And I think there's two that are kind of standing out. So one is, what are the barriers to getting access to land? And I'm going to allow the group to respond to what access to land can mean in different ways. And then another question, which is on how do you balance this like long-term tension of governance to manage the kind of like creating long-term ownership / belonging model versus trying stuff out and being much more exploratory. So I've paraphrased the questions, but those are the two: barriers to access to land, and then the tension between the long-term strategy and then the scope to explore and be much more experimental.
Land is so expensive in this country, and a lot of new entrants to farming go to places like Portugal, Spain, where land is cheaper, and like there's a tension between them and local people for doing that. But yeah, I mean, like it's very hard for people in general to get into farming. So in like the trespassing bill that was just brought in has made it a lot harder for people to even wander around the country. And there's a long history of enclosures and kicking people off the land so that they could work in factories here, cultivating or manufacturing things that were being brought in from our parents' homelands. So yeah, I mean, there's numerous reasons why it's really hard to get onto the land, like accessing green spaces. How hard is it to just get out of London for a start, especially if you don't drive? And I've been really feeling that under lockdown. And that, yeah, like who has the right to be in green spaces? Like there's a farmer that we know in our network. He's a Zimbabwean guy, doesn't have permission to live on the land, but is growing sort of in like just outside London. He had the police called on him 3 times in a week, and like what does acting suspicious look like, and he's growing corn. So and we know like just the fear of what that means to enter into a hostile community. And do I feel safe in most parts of Britain? No. Will there be stories if I asked about any city with a majority white population in this country? Won't be great. And so, yeah, like how do we try and like make an environment so like slightly safer, or, you know, like find little like tiny areas that we can make more welcoming before we even try to start cultivating things, or, you know, being seen to be doing something unusual. And yes, a Zimbabwean guy in Hertfordshire acting suspiciously, like that means growing corn. And how do we move beyond that so that that's completely normal? And how long is that going to take? And some of the barriers are imagined, or not imagined because they're not real, but, you know, like it's before anything's even happened. It's in anticipation. You know, what will it be like if we go to that lake? What will it, you know, who's going to stare at us if we go in this town? And then some of them are through experience, and then some of them are really structural, and it's very hard to just get out of London or prioritize access to green spaces if you're working with like very few resources.
Daniel, do you want to go? Do you need me to reiterate the questions?
I'll go next while Daniel can prepare anything probably a little bit less structural than mine. I think Josina completely nailed it in terms of like there's so many cultural and historical things that are barriers. And then I think Alistair's written quite a lot of stuff recently, and he wrote up his talk from a couple of days ago into quite like clear step by step. Like there's a bunch of actual structural things that if we can topple some of them over as well, we can kind of unlock a bunch of stuff around a new land contract in this country. And it's a bit geeky, but it's still fun to know this stuff, because I think then you can kind of work backwards, right? And go, right, okay, well, after this experiment, after this bit, it's actually like this piece of like, I don't know, legislation or something that we need to fight for. And I find that sort of stuff really fascinating and useful. So I think there's barriers that you can read in a 20-minute blog if you want, that's like go back years. And the second just little part I just want to say is that I think I agree with Sarah in the chat. There's loads of layers of this, right? Which goes all the way from what it means to be able to culturally just do stuff on your street and start moving that forward. And then who's allowed to do that? Because we do have some good like tactical urbanism stuff going on in the country. It's not like we don't, right? If you came to some of the other talks, and like, you know, Daniel can talk about hundreds of things that we've watched, followed, or been part of over the years. Like there's no lack of those things. It's about who's allowed to do those things, right? Because the people who are allowed to do those things are now in the next stage of the conversation about how do we turn these tactical urbanism like stuff like edible, incredible, or incredible edible, or parklet movement, or playing out. Like these are all great things, right? Like I'm not here to the brilliant, but they're on the next stage of like, how do we turn those things into legislation? How do we turn it into like orchards on the high street and all of that? So they're already on that next stage. Whereas I think in communities of colour and underserved communities, we're still like, I'm not going to say, I'm talking from a position of privilege, but on the whole, the conversation here is talking about like, how do we even get out and be able to be safe to be on the land, right? And so it's very different if you decide to take over a parklet and do some stuff that is illegal, technically illegal, tactical urbanism type stuff, like a little orchard or a grow where you are, or take over a piece of land and do something with it, than it is to like do it if you're of underserved like demographics. And then what happens is it's like it becomes criminal and all sorts of other stuff. So I think there's a whole conversation there. And just to finish, having said that, in response to the link that Sarah put in, mate, I'm just going to say to you, when this happened, I was like devastated, because a bunch of really awesome people just like started to make a little garden on a horrible patch of land that like nothing had happened with it. And when I say horrible, I mean the way that the council had just left it there. And they built this beautiful garden, looted, and the council actually came and ripped it out rather than let it sit there. So I think there's some deep stuff here. about even just like how powerful landowners are, and the right that they want to exert over people is a whole nother conversation. And then the third one is local authorities just want to hold on to the land to see how long they can wait to sell it to developers, because that makes them big money, and that's part of a different cycle of other stuff too. But yeah, so those are my like more boring technical ones. But yeah, Daniel, I don't know if you wanted to share some stuff.
Yeah, so what I was thinking was just on this question of access to land. For me and my own experiences, like access to land was a case of talking to my neighbour and asking a question as to what's going on with this space here. And sometimes it can be about just like having an imagination of what can be done, which I think our imaginations have been co-opted anyway as to what we can do with land around us. So starting there, and how people can find, like, if you've got dreams to do something like that, and then going to ask that question, or asking a question might not be actually talking to someone, it might be actually doing something and then seeing what happens, because that then you learn that like that's where the barrier actually is. It's because this person thinks this, or these people, but they won't necessarily say that until you actually try and do something. So it's kind of, I think the barriers sometimes are just also internal, like as to just having that sense of agency that comes to kind of like just try something or ask some questions. And how do we cultivate that is my question to bring to people, because if more people, I guess, started to like imagine the multiple possibilities for the land around us, then we would be in a different place. But we're just kind of told that this is what it's, how it is and how it should be, because no one's been able to imagine anything different and then try a thing. Yeah.
No, that's a really, really good point. It's been quite hard to find funding for Lion because of that. Like the people who traditionally fund, you know, BAME groups are like, what, land? And I remember speaking to someone who was like 2 days from retirement that was like, yeah, but yeah, like you can talk about land, it all sounds really nice, but we need numbers, and there's no research on this. So we can't do, like, there's been no interest in it for so long. Large land, like where you get funding for land projects, like they're not as interested in racial justice work. So we're sitting at a really awkward intersection of like, yeah, just like it's transformative in both sectors, and we don't have a lot of evidence to back it up. So I'm really glad that you raised that as like, how do we transform people's minds in order to push the conversation forward?
And I think that point is at 30 Percy, who some of us, me and I, work with, and we've been having these kind of conversations last year around land and what land reparations could look like. And you know, we don't have the same settler colonialism kind of dynamics, but what we do have is the accumulation and the ability to own land as a result of colonialism. So there is, the dynamic is still there. We've also got a climate change movement that a lot of it had emerged out of like conserving land out of empire, and so a lot of the climate movement charities came from that trajectory. And so when we think about land, the points on imagination are so important, because to think about public or commoning land, you have to change who the public is. And right now we don't exist as part of the public imagination as the public, or deserving of the things that the mainstream perception of what the public is. And I think that's a huge shift, and it's precisely the reason why what Josina, you know, Lion makes absolute sense to those of us who get its strategic potential, what it can do, how liberating it is. But for those where we exist outside of the public, it of course doesn't make sense. It's outside of that logic. So I really, really appreciate the point on imagination, because that is a huge shift that we need to be working on. And if there are people on the call who are thinking, well, what can I do to shift? How are you participating? The narrative shifts around who the public is. And I think, you know, Stuart Hall's work really opened up some of that conversation, and so many others on that.
But just to say, yeah, like Farzana, I'm really with you there, which is like, it's only one point of the system, but like being in the background with the likes of 30 Percy and others, and just like basically, the thing that I really care about in this work, right, is when you're working in such a complex system that needs so many different things to move and change, and then like this deep transformative shift in us to, and Peter spoke to this question in the chat, this deep transformative moment in us that needs to move away from capitalist ownership ideas, but those ideas still exist in order for us to be like able to do it with some rights and legally in this country. But we need to at the same time also move back into like a belonging. It is complicated, right? And I think that's the thing that I always say in these land conversations, that you can start to like read all these different things and be like flipping overwhelmed by it all and go, well, this is a 400, 500-year system that we don't know how to like topple. But, you know, if you follow some of Daniel's work and the stuff that I've seen of Josina's work, is that there are loads of practical ways, but also from within the system, wherever you're working. So the stuff that Farzana and we didn't realize we were both doing it from different angles until we met each other, you know, getting in behind the funders and the other people to just start telling them, right, like this is one of the most, going to steal Alistair's quote here, well, not quote, but his language, literally rebuilding the land contract is literally the most significant transformation we can do for everything else, right? And when we do that, like for all the white allies and others in this conversation, it's also going to be transformative for everyone else, because you're also dying in this system, right? Just in different ways. And if you don't like want maybe believe that read Alistair's blog, right? Everything goes back to land, air pollution, like our rights, our health, it all goes back to the land in both a spiritual and transformational way, but also a practical way. So like keep following all the different bits, and that's for me the stop, because I really would love like Josina to close up, but tell us like where you're finding hope, Josina. What kind of practical projects and things can we expect from Lion, and also what do you need support with, right? Like, so you talked about funding and stuff like that, like say it with your whole chest, man. What do people in this chat and around who start to come across this talk need to do to support you to do this work? Yeah, because that's one of the most important things of how we look after each other in this and resource the work in meaningful ways.
Okay, what we have coming up, I mean, we have to think about this in a long-term way, because who knows what we're doing next week at the moment. But over the next decade, we plan to do lots more gatherings of Black and brown people on the land. And there are lots of places that have invited us to do that are run by people of colour or people that are making an increased commitment to doing work that's transformative and with a justice focus. What gives me hope is that the movement is growing so quickly, and it's been a really overwhelming few weeks, and it's quite difficult feeling like you're riding a wave of, there are people that are doing that anti-racist work in new ways. Where we need support, I guess, like we're using a framework, and so people who want to support redistribution and reparations are very welcome to contact Lion to do that, and that can be in terms of like resources and land as well, and people who are looking to you know, transform how their land is used. Like at the moment we need resources while we're still in cities, but as projects expand, but also not assuming that we're able to do very much based outside of our locale at the moment. And so if you're not connecting with Black and brown people in your area but want Lion to come and do something on your land, then maybe there needs to be a shift in how you're looking at it. You know, there are communities around Britain, there are groups that need opportunities to be out on the land and run their own events in spaces where they you know, like that they traditionally can't access. So yeah, like we are a small collective running on a shoestring, and we are hoping to be part of building a movement, and the movement is across the country. and will look different in different places about the northwest of England. Make claims to understand the land struggles in Wales, Scotland, or Ireland, and in those places there are BIPOC communities that you know, have struggled with a sense of belonging, same as in London, same as in England. So there's a lot to look forward to. There's a lot to hope for. I hope to see a lot of you on the land one day and do that deep, deep healing work. And I'm really glad that there's now a language to articulate all of those intersecting struggles, and that the basis of all of it is land.
And to really hone in on recognizing this moment and the different ways that you're being called, that there is a movement building around it, and those that are interested in connecting with Josina and Land in Our Names, then when you are getting in touch, like, create capacity by, you know, Imi has said this, and I really appreciate it. Like, think about, you know, if you want to collaborate, especially if you are from a privileged identity, like, what are the things you can bring to the table? Just be very clear around it. If you have access to land, if you've got an idea, you know, put it in a brief. Put timelines, dates, resourcing, all of that. Like, create it so clear that the small group that Lion is right now can meet that with the appropriate capacity, and it just might not be right now. And so really, like, diffusing some of the entitlement and coming with creating capacity to support Lion and Josina's work is really key in building that kind of movement that I think everyone has been speaking to. Thank you
so much for saying that. Because I'm tired.
I know, babe. And Imi, Daniel, and Josina, thank you so much for hosting this, for sharing your thoughts. And it's going to be online, the video, at some point. And do follow the work of Lion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
is there anything that?
Yeah, I'll wrap up. Yeah, thank you so much, Farzana. Thank you, Farzana and Josina. It's like, I just feel like we need to keep having loads and loads more conversations like this to just ground ourselves and feel hope that the movement is like growing in so many incredible and broad and different ways. And when we come together, I think it's going to be like so exciting. And also just to say, yeah, Farzana, fully agree. I think Farzana and I have both been on this like campaign the last few months where anybody who said to us like, oh, how do we started to say like, come with a plan, tell us what's there, what resource you have, what the timelines are. Don't just come with oh, I heard you talk the other day. I was wondering if we could meet up or have a chat about the thing. Not that that's not useful sometimes to people, but yo, like, we're in the middle of a pandemic and a global uprising. And so big up on that, for what Farzana said. Like, make sure you come, especially on this stuff, with your land, with your money, with your timeline. Because we just got to get on with the work now. And yeah, big shout out to Farzana as well. Please check out her work at Healing Justice London. And yeah, go check out Land in Our Names and support Josina. And thank you, Daniel, for co-hosting. Thank you so much, Josina, Farzana. Lots of love. Have a great Sunday.
Bye. Thank you.